And the goal here is not is to make a parallel to things that have been discussed yesterday and things that are going to be discussed after in the next topics, in the next slots. The goal here is just not to talk about China, just have one presentation on other markets, Europe, North America, but also a few things in other developing countries. But then just to set the ground, I'm sure you'll be familiar with some or most of the elements of this presentation, but it's always good to have everything compiled, and then from these we can set the ground for the next presentations. So the topic I was asked to bring was to look at Euro 6 and even if it's not there, at how legislation is happening in North America, and to look at emissions and fuel economy standards and how they could be somehow used and how they have been used so far as a reference for other countries and regions trying to get to the same levels of emission limits. Just before getting into the actual topic, I've added that it's very simple, something we use for our in-house training, but people always ask, why do you need two different standards for emissions? And I think it's just a simple way of understanding why CO2 fuel economy standards have to be treated separately. When you look at particulates, NOx, hydrocarbons, CO, they all bring health, environmental concerns, and for this reason they have to be the emissions have to be minimized. The direct impact is on air quality, on air quality, and particularly in urban areas, metropolitan regions. But then, so cities have to minimize the amount of pollutants that are dangerous, nocive for health, environment, and then air quality standards are set up. But the way you have to minimize those is to generate less. And air quality standards are ultimately the main driver for emission standards that apply to mobile and stationary sources. And then the question comes on CO2. Why CO2 has to be treated differently? Basically, CO2 is the result of the perfect combustion, hydrocarbon with oxygen. So you want to make as much CO2 as possible in comparison to the other pollutants where you want to get to very low levels. But CO2 is not a pollutant. It's part of the air now. You're breathing, you are releasing CO2, but it has climate change concerns. CO2 is a greenhouse gas. So the way you have to not minimize, but to generate less CO2 is not within an emission standard, because it doesn't bring any environmental concern, but it is by consuming less fuel. And that's why greenhouse gas and fuel economy standards tends to go to be established in parallel, and ultimately they roughly the same: consume less fuel and generate less CO2. So with this in mind, that's my plan for the day. We'll take a look at current standards for Europe and North America, and also a snapshot of what's coming. Then we'll look at fuel economy CO2 requirements for heavy-duty trucks, and then what's happening beyond Europe and North America as well, where things are with China and with other main markets. And then we'll have a few slides just to summarize and show how these regulations are affecting the vehicle and the after-treatment markets. So such current emission standards, although quite simple in this slide, probably most of these numbers are familiar for all of you. Euro 6 was implemented 5 years ago for new type approvals, and then 1 year later, 2014, for all new registrations in the EU. And it had a few, looking at the limits, the main changes were NOx 80% lower than for Euro 5. So it reduced it from 2 grams per kilowatt hour to 0.4. And it introduced a particle number limit, which before was there was a limit for particulate matter, but not for the number. It also so other than these stricter limits, it also came with different things, new test cycles, the WHSC and TC, that are more representative of real-world driving conditions, compared to the previous cycle called NEDC, which was relatively mild in terms of speed, engine loads. The particulate number limit, there's a limit for ammonia to avoid overdosing of AdBlue in the SR system, and other requirements related to useful life, durability, and off-cycle testing requirements. A quick look, North America took a quite different approach compared to Europe, and standards have been in North America for even longer. The current standards have been in place since 2010, and they were effectively implemented in 2007 at 90% reduction on the particulate matter limit from 0.10 to 0.01 grams per bhp hour, and they're not directly comparable. If you look at like North America has a lower NOx limit compared to Europe, but then Europe has a slightly lower NOx PM limit compared to North America. And but then standards were introduced in 2007 with a phasing period where 50% of the engines were expected to meet the 0.2 gram NOx limit, and then 2010 that became the limit for heavy commercial vehicle engines. And in the meantime, it was possible to accumulate credits if the corporate emissions levels for a company for a manufacturer were below that 50% limit, which allowed some manufacturers to extend the use of extend sales of trucks without SCR, but 2 or 3 years later, every single manufacturer in North America had to move to an SCR configuration. What is also different in North America is testing cycle requirements. In Europe, as I said, they've just moved it to a WHSC cycle, but in North America there has been this FTP transient test that is stricter than the European equivalent, and also the North American standards. They require the supplemental emission tests where the same engine has to be tested at different configurations of engine speed and loads. And there's also a test called not to exceed that looks at boundaries and extreme results emissions at some more extreme driving conditions, and then there are limits to for each pollutant in terms of how higher they can be. In the US, there are federal limits, but states are also allowed to implement to establish their own requirements, provided they're not going to be contradictory. So if there's a federal limit of 0.2, a state cannot establish a limit of 0.5 and say, we want to be less strict. But they are, if they are not contradictory, they are allowed. And California has been driving the implementation of stricter NOx and particulate standards. This is a chart California issued 2 years ago, showing how their forecast and their targets for up to 2050. And what we can see, what is highlighted in this chart is California's planning wants to move to a fleet that is essentially following low NOx standards, lower than the current federal limits. What California did was 2015, so about 3 years ago from now, 2.5, 3 years ago, California issued a regulation authorizing manufacturers to, with optional ultra-low NOx standards. So the federal level is 0.2, so if your engine is meeting 0.2 grams per bhp hour, fine. But it was possible to certify engines at lower emission levels. And they created three levels. Instead of 0.2 federal, they allowed engines to be certified at 0.1, 0.05, and 0.02. So roughly speaking, engines that would be 50, 75, 90% lower than the federal levels. And the interest of having, even if these standards are optional, the interest is local districts, particularly in areas where pollution got became worse. It would be possible to for those local areas to grant subsidies and to fund and to grant incentives for buyers to purchase these cleaner trucks. And this has been driving the next for North America. So this is current. Taking a look at what's next for Europe. There's very little going on. There's some discussions already in place, but we don't know much. There isn't anything officially proposed, but there have been conversations and working groups talking about the next steps. What we know is, or at least the indication we got so far, is that they're not necessarily focusing on lowering the current emission limits, but it's mainly, the focus is mainly going to be on in-service conformity, real-world driving conditions, following all discussions and all the events that took place in the passenger car light-duty vehicle market, where diesel cars have been polluting more than in paper, and they are the in-service conformity is already part of the current standards. But what we see happening in Europe is a stronger move for real conditions and to make sure that trucks will generate will be polluting as expected and not over the actual limits. In North America, it's a bit more interesting. So 2 years ago, after the California Air Resource Board implemented those optional low NOx standards, the agency issued a petition to the Federal Environmental Protection Agency to create a working group and to work together to move those low NOx standards to a federal level. So not only in California, but the goal was to make it nationwide. And they were targeting at that time an implementation discussions between last year and next one for something that would be implemented from 2023 onwards. There was some initial discussions between CARB and EPA, but since last year the Trump administration had a freeze in all EPA activities. The EPA is cannot officially discuss any new regulation, and it's not climate change and pollution is not the main priority of the new U.S. government, and so nothing's happening at a federal level. But in California, the agency is keen to go ahead to make the optional standards become mandatory, even if it's not going to happen at a federal level. And I forgot to say, discussions on the latest discussions we had in our US conference were that it is possible to meet those ultra low NOx standards with diesel engines. It's just a matter of adjusting calibration and using more AdBlue and using more of the SCR system and injecting AdBlue at different parts in the exhaust that would allow engines to meet the 0.02 NOx level. Good. So on the fuel economy CO2 side, as I said, they're all treated separately because CO2 is not a pollutant. And then it makes more sense to look at North America first because it's where the legislation is more has been established so far. The greenhouse gas fuel economy requirements, they are treated by two different agencies in the US. The EPA cover pollutant emissions. They also cover greenhouse gas emissions. And the NHTSA, which is a different agency, looks at vehicle efficiency and fuel economy improvements. And for this reason, they had a joint regulation that was implemented. We call it GAG Phase 1 standards, and these standards were implemented for a few years ago, but they started to apply for trucks sold in 2014 for the first time. And they cover a wide range from the light-duty vehicles, not the passenger cars and part of light-duty vehicles are covered by separate legislation, but the large light-duty vehicles, medium and heavy, are covered by this regulation as well. And now they have already issued the final rule for the next step of this legislation, called Phase 2 standards, and they're aiming for further fuel economy and greenhouse gas reduction, starting model year 2021, implemented in 3 steps up to 2027. But one thing that was not covered in the first legislation was standards for trailers. Trailers used in combination tractors. And then the Phase 2 standards came with provisions for trailers that would apply from model year 2018. The only detail on that was that there have been requests for the agencies to review these rules because, according to some bodies, trailers are not necessarily are not moving objects alone, and therefore they cannot be ruled by emission standards. So there have been some conversations on that, but what we would see is that for the majority of heavy-duty trucks, the limits will change again in 2021. Flowchart to understand how things have been established, but it's basically 2014 phase 1 initial requirements, last year phase 1 final requirements, and then further reduction from 2021 onwards with final limits in 2027. And for trailers, an earlier implementation because they were not covered by the first set of standards. And it means it's hard to put numbers to it because combination these all, when you look at all heavy-duty vehicles covered by this legislation, they can be quite different from each other. So they are placed in a few different categories. And also the baseline changed between phase 1 and phase 2. So it's complicated to look at numbers, but that gives an idea that for most vehicles covered by these standards, at the end, by 2027, those vehicles would be 30 to 40% more fuel efficient than what they were before the first step of the legislation. So from up to the pre-2014 vehicles. In Europe, things are happening as well, but at a slower pace. The main concerns in Europe were how to measure and how to predict CO2 emissions for any type of truck, and because it depends depending on how the truck is set up. A full truck would generate more emissions than an empty truck, and there are other setup conditions that influence emissions in trucks. So the first step for Europe was to establish a measurement tool, and it was just last year that the European Commission approved the use of Vector. Vector is a vehicle energy consumption calculation tool, and it works with a series of inputs that are used in an algorithm to predict the CO2 emissions for that specific configuration. And after approving and validating the model, now starting next year, the European Commission is going to use these. Manufacturers will be required to monitor and report CO2 emissions and fuel consumption data, and that's going to be based on a list of 73 data inputs, of which most of them are going to be publicly available. So there's going to be a lot of transparency in terms of how much CO2 is going to be generated and how much, how the trucks had been set up and how much CO2 they would be generating. And just recently, I think 2 weeks ago, 2 or 3, and actually I'm saying it's on the 19th of May, not in May 2019. So apologies for this. So just weeks ago, the European Commission indicated that it is going to be working on fuel economy targets for heavy-duty trucks in Europe, and the initial targets are 15% reduction by 2025 and 30% reduction by 2030, using 2019, the first year of vector reporting, using as a baseline. But there are still discussions on how manufacturers are going to to cope with fuel economy improvements alongside very low NOx and particulate emissions. That's mainly the current status for how regulations are developing in Europe and North America. Taking a look at the global, I try to look at all different countries with where there have been activities in terms of emission standards, and as we can see, it was Europe and North America setting up their current standards earlier, and then some countries have already fully aligned. Japan, Turkey, South Korea, and other countries in Asia, and then other major markets have already announced targets and are going to align with those one of those standards within the next couple of years. And by these major markets, we're talking about India, Mexico, China, and Brazil. The one thing that plays a lot in these targets is fuel quality. I haven't got the equivalent fuel quality chart to compare, but in most cases, fuel quality has been the main obstacle for governments to be able to implement the right fuel a stricter fuel standard. Just to give some idea, I think it's worth looking at India and Brazil a bit more closely. So India is currently on a Euro 4 equivalent, but it has announced a year and a half ago it will move to skip Euro 5 and move to an Euro 6 equivalent from April 2020 onwards. The main obstacle for India has been so far the having the right fuel quality nationwide available. It seems to be sorted now. At least the fuel producers or oil companies have committed to have 10 ppm diesel available nationwide by April 2020. Even if not everywhere, because all trucks would still be able to use high sulfur grades. But it's the goal is to have sufficiently available in a way that new trucks will be able to get 10 ppm diesel, whatever they are. And Delhi is already on a 10 ppm diesel mandate. So trying to align with European standards, they are currently on an Euro 5 equivalent. But discussions are just taking place now. We expect a final rule to be published in June, July, for an implementation by 2022, 2023. So the country is getting to trying to get to the same level. The main issue behind is the current economic situation that truck sales have been extremely low since 2015, even if slightly recovering, but still very far from the levels that could be seen a few years ago. And there are concerns that Euro 6 trucks could be even more expensive and prevent sales to improve. Just taking a quick look at how this translates into volumes for vehicle and SCR markets. This is our high-level forecast on vehicle sales. These trucks only, it's not trucks and buses, but this gives an overview that we expect. We expect truck sales within somewhere between 3 and 3.4 million units a year over the next few years. Most of these trucks are diesel. Diesel represents about 90 to 95% of the current market, so not a huge difference when you move from the total vehicle sales to diesel vehicle sales only. But then diesel sales to SCR, then there's quite a big difference. 2017, it was about 50 to 60% of the global heavy-duty market in medium heavy-duty truck market with SCR, increasing 2018-19, but it's mainly after 2020 that we're going to see this SCR penetration jumping from 60 to 80%, 85%, and this is primarily driven by China 6A, China 6 in 2020, and by Bharat 6 in India, also in 2020, 2021. And that's it. Thank you very much. As I said, these slides I showed come from some of our research and multi-client reports. We have a service looking at the global SCR markets, and we also have service looking at the specific markets like China, India, Europe, North America, Brazil. Thank you very much. Let me know if you have any questions. Thank you. Any questions?